and we will post the recording on the web. We will post it under the commercial playlist in our commercial webinars section on YouTube, and we will also post a link to the recording in the events list section on the TAR website. So you'll be able to see that, and the slideshow. Jeremy has already sent me a copy of the slideshow. So both of those things will be posted for you to look at later. And I think that is all you need to know from me. So I'm going to turn off my camera, and I'm going to introduce Jeremy Meyers of EdgeCore. He's going to tell you a little bit about EdgeCore and what they do and what he does for them. And I will talk to you guys in a little bit. All right, Jeremy, go ahead, take it away.
Sounds great, Amy. I guess, first of all, I just want to double check that my screen is showing up for you.
Yes, I do see it. It says a connected world. It has some very attractive succulents.
Okay, perfect. Well, Amy, thank you again for the opportunity to speak with the Texas Realtors Association. Really appreciate it, and everyone's time on the phone. I know it's valuable this morning, so want to make sure this is informative and pertinent to your world here. So we're going to educate everyone on the line this morning about the data center sector and how that applies to real estate. So we'll jump into it here. So as Amy mentioned, I'm Jeremy Meyers. I'm the Director of Real Estate for EdgeCore Internet Real Estate. We are a data center REIT that was formed earlier this year. We're about 8 months old when all is said and done. Prior to joining EdgeCore, I was at CBRE, the commercial real estate services firm, for about 4 years. And while I was at CBRE, I helped run their data center practice and their advisory and transaction services group. So we did all of the sales, leasing, and consulting for data center properties and assets globally. So we worked with a number of different users in that realm. So both investors in the space, occupiers/tenants, and then data center providers. And we did that across sales, leasing, and consulting assignments. So took that background and knowledge, transferred it over to EdgeCore here, where it's a little bit of a misnomer with the title, but I actually run our enterprise and kind of channel or partner sales organization. So working directly with an end user or an enterprise customer, or working with a partner or a representative such as a broker who's representing a large enterprise customer. So the idea is to bring them over to the EdgeCore platform here. So what is EdgeCore? So we are a newly formed entity. We're a data center REIT. We've been fortunate enough to secure institutional capital to fund and back us. Our initial tranche of capital will allow us to do over $2 billion of data center development. That's earmarked for domestic investment initially, with subsequent upsized tranches being allocated toward international expansion and development. So with that institutional capital and that North American focus, we are building what we call our national data center platform. So we are going to be able to support what we call hyperscale users and large enterprise users. So if you liken that to a commercial model that I think most people understand, there's kind of your Sam's Costco, there's your local Target, and then there's your corner store. So we are essentially the large wholesaler. So we're kind of the Costco Sam's Club of the data center world. So selling in bulk to large users that consume that amount of capacity. So although we are new, our leadership and executive team, this certainly isn't their first rodeo. They average about 10 years of working experience together, and they've done about $10 billion of data center investment, management, and development. So our founding members are ex-CoreSite executives. CoreSite is one of the larger data center REITs out there. So they took their expertise, transferred it over here to the EdgeCore platform, and we're trying to build data centers that essentially enable customers, whether they're cloud or kind of technology service providers, to really grow and flourish. So we're doing that initially with the national platform, which is focused in 5 tier 1 data center markets right now. So that includes the Silicon Valley in California, Reno, Nevada, Phoenix, Arizona, Dallas, Texas, and Northern Virginia. So in each of those markets, we're building these large campus-style deployments capable of over 100 megawatts per campus. Square footage-wise, that translates to over 1 million square feet per campus typically. and we'll get more into the power side of that equation. But the idea behind building those large campus-style deployments is that you can accommodate for not only the present demand, but the future demand of those growing technology-based companies. So before we get into this any further, you're probably wondering, what is a data center? So a data center, from a technical standpoint, is a building that houses IT hardware and infrastructure, and it's supported by a number of systems, typically power, cooling, and then there's obviously the connectivity infrastructure portion of that. So usually a data center, while not the case all the time, they're usually a purpose-built building. There's some companies out there that decide to do retrofits of existing shells or properties, but EdgeCore's approach to this market is we're building entirely purpose-built greenfield data centers. So on the slide here, you'll see a little rendering. This is actually a rendering of our Reno, Nevada campus. So this one will support just over 1 million square feet and about 196 megawatts of data center capacity. So on the little diagram here, there are a number of components which are typically unique to a data center. You have generators that are on the side of the building. Those essentially power or provide power to the IT gear inside. In the event that there's a failure from the utility provider or there's some type of power interruption. Data centers typically run very sensitive compute and workloads. It's the application, it's the applications, it's the cloud, it's the internet, it's all that data that we consume. So it's very important to keep these facilities up and running. Power is typically served by an on-site substation at the scale that we're building our campuses. That's essentially table stakes here. So that allows us to have better reliability, better control over the power, and it also gives our customers a better window into what does our ability to help them expand and grow look like. And as I mentioned, there's a connectivity piece too. So network, fiber infrastructure. If you're thinking about your typical residential home, everyone's got cable or some type of internet connectivity. It's the same thing, but on a much larger scale at a data center. So it's not only important to run those compute and those workloads in the data center, but distributing them out into the world so that people can interact with them is key. And then all of this power, all of this infrastructure generates massive amounts of heat. So we cool our facilities with air-cooled chillers that are on top of our roof. There are a number of different ways that companies cool their data centers. The way that we've done it is air-cooled chillers on the roof, and we use a closed-loop water system. So that essentially means we don't use or expend any water in our cooling process. I know data centers in the news have recently gotten a bad rep for using a lot of energy for consuming water, things like that. So we're taking a very renewable kind of green approach with the way that we build and operate our data centers. And then obviously these buildings are very important as far as the functionality and what's happening inside of them. So security is a must, not only at the perimeter where you have secure access via fences, but you have internal systems such as biometric access, you have man traps, different components in the facility that really help protect and secure different levels of criticality within the building. So that's all well and good. We've established what a data center is, but where are data centers found? And I think this goes back to the traditional saying in real estate where it's location, location, location. So there are a number of factors that really play into why data centers are where they are. And those can include a myriad of reasons that are relevant. They can also include a myriad of reasons that are not so relevant. Typically, corporations would build and operate their own data centers. That often resulted in them building the data center as an annex on their corporate headquarters, or the CIO would build the data center and a place he liked to vacation. And I'm not making that one up, actually. It really happens. So there are obviously a plethora of reasons for where they're located, but what we typically see are the following. So data centers, I mean, networking connectivity is paramount and very centric to what you're doing. It's great if you compute all that information if you're running your servers, but if you can't get that information out into the world, interacting with people, generating revenue, doesn't do you any good. So networking connectivity is huge. And that also plays into interconnection. So you can think of interconnection similar to like a large shopping mall where you have a large aggregation of a number of stores. So it's easy to get from one to another. So you have interconnection points, which are sometimes incorporated into what we call carrier hotels, which I'll touch on later. But that essentially allows that customer, that user, to pass their traffic, pass their information onto other carriers, other businesses more effectively. So it's kind of a central aggregation point. So for some deployments, for some companies, that really matters. No matter what, the taxes and incentives piece are huge for data centers. Everyone's always concerned about cost and driving that down. So we typically see data centers aggregate in areas with lower taxes and favorable incentives. That's not to say that outweighs things like operational performance of the applications and the proximity to consumers using the products which are being sent and received by the data center. So at the end of the day, this is a utility. It has to work. So that's important. And then latency plays into that. So latency is the time it takes information essentially to get from point A to point B. And that's network driven. So if you're too far away, you're going to degrade your performance. That has impacts on customers, on revenue. So it needs to be within an acceptable threshold or latency distance from those customers. Climate also plays into that. I'm sure everyone's seen news articles of large social media companies, web companies that have data centers in the Scandinavian countries, and they use outside air to cool them. That's a component for some folks. Climate in general, too, if you have more of an ambient temperature, one that doesn't fluctuate throughout the year, that does help your energy utilization to a degree. Power cost and availability are huge. Anytime you can control operating expenses and the ability to grow and expand, that's really going to speak volumes to a customer. And a lot of customers, whether they're co-locating in a data center like EdgeCore, or if they have that in-house, access to IT talent is huge. So being in a market that allows them to have that skill set and those people that can run and operate their facilities is paramount. Hazard risk is another component, whether that's man-made or natural disaster. Obviously, people are very risk averse with the type of infrastructure and IT gear they put in these facilities. So it has to reside somewhere that's safe. And proximity to major MSAs is another one where we see a lot of users kind of shifting towards. So as large cities, population centers continue to grow, those people populating them and the devices that they're using continue to consume more data. So it's easier and it's better from a performance perspective, oftentimes, to locate that data center closer to all those consumers. So this gets down into,
Jeremy,
oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I have a quick question for you. So as, you know, this is a relatively new type of building. Do you, as the demand for these things becomes greater and greater, which it's only going to do, I presume, do you think that there is going to be a stronger tendency for there to be certain places where data centers cluster, or do you think that eventually it will change so that there is a specific data center at a specific place, like a small town might have its own data center as they put all of their services online? Or is it going to be more like it has been in the early days of computing with, you know, clusters like in the Silicon Valley and Silicon Hills and things like that?
Yeah, good question, Amy. So that part of the landscape and the market is certainly changing. There's a phenomenon that people are calling the move to, like, quote, the edge. So as people move to the edge, that again speaks to putting your IT infrastructure and your servers closer to the eyeballs or the people that are utilizing that content and that information. So I'll give you an example here. Denver, Colorado, where I sit currently, we haven't had a lot of data center activity in the past traditionally, called over the past 4 years. More recently, there's been an uptick in data center activity as more large enterprises have moved to the area, as more people have moved here, just general population base. So companies like a Netflix or a Hulu, companies like that are starting to put their data center infrastructure in places like Denver because it's easier to serve those people at the edge, those consumers and those eyeballs that are in region there. Traditionally, the model, like you're talking about, was more centralized. So you would have maybe 1 or 2 data centers for your company throughout the U.S., The idea is you have those central points of aggregation and you send everything out from there. But we're seeing a proliferation of data centers rather than a contraction. So people are moving to the edge, people are moving to different markets. That being said, there are a number of established addressable data center markets, the 5 which we're in, including Bay Area, Reno, Dallas, Phoenix, Northern Virginia, Chicago's up there as well, Atlanta. So there are a number of markets out there that are already large addressable data center markets. And then you see those secondary or emerging markets starting to become more prolific too. So there will definitely be new markets. I think it really depends upon what level of granularity you're looking at. And every data center requirement is different. I always liken it to fingerprints or a snowflake. So data centers mean different things to different companies. So it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. And that's one of the areas EdgeCore is playing in too, where we understand not everyone's requirement fits within our box or our campuses and our market strategy. So we have a build-to-suit offering where you can kind of tailor the building to someone, you can put it in the geography that matters to them. So I guess answer to your question is new markets are always emerging, and it just really depends upon the end user and what it looks like to them.
Mm-hmm. I see. All right, thanks.
No problem. Thank you for the question. So this jumps into the next point here. So what types of data centers are there? So I mentioned earlier, they're assets that are typically called carrier hotels. These are oftentimes in older buildings in more of like a metropolitan or downtown area. And they're typically a building that at one point had all of the phone lines from the phone companies terminating in these buildings. So you would call it a carrier hotel because you get like the AT&Ts, back in the day, the Honeywells, people like that, all terminating in these buildings. So it was kind of the nexus of that connectivity where you have all these networks and all this traffic exchanging. Well, that embedded infrastructure and that ecosystem of connectivity over time has grown. So these carrier hotel buildings are prevalent in, I would say, any major city throughout the U.S. There are large ones in Los Angeles. There's one Wilshire. There are a number of ones in New York City. There's 60 Hudson, 32 Avenue of the Americas. So they're spread out throughout the country and not exclusive to the U.S., but they're spread out throughout the world. That's more of like an interconnection type of data center where you typically have a smaller footprint in that facility that you lease. Rental rates are much higher in carrier hotels because you're, again, kind of paying for that location. It's the whole shopping mall mentality where you've got a lot of stores with smaller footprints there. So that's carrier hotels in a nutshell. The next one I would touch on are co-location data centers. So I would broadly generalize this as any kind of third-party data center that you could go out and lease capacity from. And within that kind of bucket, you have typically the retail side of co-location, and you have more of the wholesale co-location side of things. So EdgeCore is exclusively wholesale. Again, we deal with those larger customers, bigger blocks of space and power. And then retail is on a smaller level like that. So it's kind of your more local supermarket in the Costco kind of Sam's analogy there. So you're still selling relatively large or leasing relatively large blocks of space and power to folks, but it's on a much smaller increment than wholesale. Moving on over, you've got your traditional enterprise data centers. So this is a broad generalization, but I categorize this as any data center that a company owns. So it's not a leased asset. It's something that's on their balance sheet. They own it. They're responsible for the CapEx, the maintenance, the operations, all those things. And we've seen a large shift away from both building and maintaining enterprise data centers. Data center construction is a very capital intensive business. And for most companies, there's no way to justify the investment there. So data centers on a per square foot basis are anywhere from about $1,000 to $1,500 per square foot. So they're incredibly expensive. And most enterprises, because they don't build data centers as their core competency, can't even build to those numbers. So it becomes cost prohibitive very quickly for those folks. And they're realizing that all that capital they dump into it, they could be deploying in other areas of their business that are higher growth. So we're seeing a prevalence of outsourcing from the enterprise data centers. A lot of enterprise users are trying to shed those assets too. There have been a number in the news lately. I think Bank of America is a recent example of that, where they package up their data center assets and they sell them off because the capital investment and the ongoing operating expense is just too great to justify. And I think that's a good entree into cloud. So cloud data centers are typically owned by what we call hyperscale users. So the large kind of web, social media companies, the ones that are responsible for cloud services, things like that. So they typically have a mix of owned and leased assets. I think their biggest challenge right now, from just a data center perspective, is speed to market. So they sprinkle in a mix of co-location, typically wholesale, and then owned data center assets that they build throughout the country and throughout the world to service their customers. So that's all well and good, but why do data centers matter? So everyone on the call today, whether you're dialed in looking at the screen or you're on the phone, you're interacting with a data center right now, and you've interacted with a data center numerous times already today. So data centers essentially run and are the lifeblood of technology and all of the technology infrastructure which is in our world. So all that data that's created in the cloud, that's created in applications, content, things of that nature, it all lives in a data center somewhere. There is a quantifiable footprint for that and a cost for it too. So data centers are everywhere. And we live in a time of exponential data creation. So when you look at some of the stats and the facts for companies like a Facebook or a Snapchat or a Netflix, it's just amazing the amount of content that's being created and that's being sent out to consumers like us. So this has a number of implications. So number one, all that content creation, you have to store it somewhere. So you need storage in data centers, you need cloud storage, which then in effect lives in a data center. And then you need to push all this content out to end users. So that again plays into the whole edge phenomenon, where people are moving toward those major MSA markets, toward those large population bases to efficiently distribute that information. And from projections from a number of analysts, people in the space that look at kind of the overall data creation aspect of things, they don't see any signs of slowing down, I guess, in this regard. They characterize this as kind of the curve of the hockey stick. So I think this is only going to continue to grow. And as you look at IoT connected devices, it's amazing all the stuff in your house that you have, which is connected to a network, which is sending and receiving information. And that all lives somewhere. And the performance of it, how well it works for you, is dictated upon how it's rolled out and how that service is delivered to you. So the data center market has certainly changed over time here. As I alluded to earlier, companies traditionally built and owned their own data centers as well as operating them. So they've migrated to more of a third-party solution model where they're outsourcing that to co-location and data center providers like an EdgeCore. And data center traffic has been, I think, one of the key factors that has really pushed that migration as well. So traditionally, enterprises had a very kind of clustered data center strategy where it was non-distributed. You might have a few assets throughout the country, and the idea was, let's pull all the information from our customers, everyone like that. Let's pull it into our data centers and let's keep it there. So the majority of data center traffic traditionally came into the data center. When you look at data centers now, the majority of the traffic is going out. So they're trying to distribute that compute, that content, those workloads to people, whether it's business to business or business to consumer or consumer to consumer. They're trying to get that information out there. So that again is pushing toward the edge, those major MSA markets. So you can no longer serve effectively your customer base from one or two sites domestically. And then there's always the own versus lease dilemma. So this, again, I think you can point to the maturation of this market and people migrating away from the CapEx intensive business of owning and operating their own data centers. So having it as an operating expense in the lease agreement is certainly more attractive. It's better from an economies of scale standpoint. And not only data centers, but companies are switching to cloud services as well. So I quantify those as more of a subscription service. It's kind of pay as you go, swipe your credit card to get you signed up. So there are a number of different ways you can look at these these solutions and the implications from a financial model perspective. So your traditional enterprise data center, that's an on-balance sheet CapEx asset. Co-location is more of an OpEx lease one. And then you have your cloud services, which are an OpEx subscription service. So various levels of commitment there. I always liken it to owning, leasing, and then using like a ride sharing service for transportation. So there are multiple levels of that depending upon what you need. And then data centers versus traditional commercial real estate. So as this market has matured, there are more data center providers out there offering services to end users. So if you turn the clock back about 10 years ago here, 2008 timeframe, right about the financial crisis, there were only a handful of data center operators out there, and they had pretty limited footprints. After the financial crisis happened and corporations had to be a lot more conservative about how they outlay capital, there was a huge growth in the data center market because they're outsourcing what had traditionally been an insourced activity for those enterprises. So over time, not only with the financial crisis, but as technology has evolved and adapted, the data center provider segment has grown drastically. And initially, when you looked at the data center landscape, because there were few providers, there were few markets, prices were considerably higher than they are today for data center product. So that brings in a number of opportunities from a savings perspective if you have clients with existing data center footprints. And it's also, I think it speaks well to the maturity of the sector and how margins and efficiencies have improved, or I should say margins have been driven down over time, and efficiencies with construction, build costs, things like that have improved. So the economics now for leasing a data center are more favorable than they've ever been. So why do you and your clients need to know about data centers? So I think more than anything, if you're in a different sector of real estate, whether it's office, retail, industrial, residential, even to a degree, it's a differentiated value proposition. If you have business you're pitching, if you're trying to win or convert some business, typically your competitors won't ask about the data center aspect of things. They won't understand, or they won't know that that's a component of that company's real estate or IT footprint. So I think number one, just being cognizant of that, showing that you know that's a component of their overall real estate strategy is certainly helpful. And solving for the data center aspect of a business is much more of a, I would say, a business impact, or kind of a business, to quantifiable business impact that you're helping deliver to that organization. So, and a good data center strategy can improve not only the financial but the operational health of that organization. And a lot of enterprise users look at the data center as a strategic differentiator for them. So data centers and companies, while they do run servers and IT infrastructure, if you think about it, that's driving revenue oftentimes for companies. It's helping them secure customers, deliver better services that their clients are going to purchase and buy. So being able to set up an effective strategy around that and then execute upon it will deliver measurable value and impact to that company. And as I mentioned before, with the market maturity here, as things have gone on over time, there are more data center providers, prices have been driven down. There's huge savings opportunities. So I've seen leases from 10 years ago, the delta in the renewals, there's anywhere from, call it a 200 to a 400% savings on renewals that you can achieve for your clients. And while I was at CBRE, there was, I should say, the past year I was at CBRE in 2017, there were 9 specific data center transactions we worked on that we delivered over $100 million of savings to the client on each one of those. So 9 deals, over $1 billion of savings on each one. So the order of magnitude that these bring from an economic perspective to that organization is just astronomical. And because data centers involve a lot of infrastructure, there's a lot of capital that goes into the build and essentially the lease, the commissions and fees are much higher than in traditional commercial real estate. So commissions on data center leases are 4% of total contract value for a wholesale data center lease, like the stuff EdgeCore is engaged with here. So simple math, if there's a $10 million deal, which I would say is on the small side, our average that we see is about $25 million. that $10 million deal equates to about a $400,000 commission. So the opportunities economically here for brokers and advisors are certainly pretty compelling, I think, when you compare them to other asset classes in commercial real estate. So you might be wondering if this. Oh, go ahead, Amy.
So what this basically means is people are sort of having to rethink their whole strategy about embarking upon building a commercial home, you know, for a company. Basically, these days you have got to take that data, that place to put your data into consideration in ways that, say, 20 years ago people just didn't. It's now just sort of a built-in part of, say, like when Toyota built up in Dallas, that was probably part of their strategy from the very beginning. It's where we're going to put all our data. Do you see people that are, are people sort of twigging to that, or is it are people still catching up to that idea? I'm not sure.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, great question, Amy. So it's a little bit of both. Every organization approaches this differently. What we're seeing too is that while the data center function in a company was traditionally held, or I should say that responsibility was traditionally held by commercial real estate, we're seeing more and more of those responsibilities and those duties being handed over to the IT side of the organization. So oftentimes there is a disconnect with the rest of the real estate portfolio. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of companies still struggle or kind of fail to see some of the synergies or the optimization benefits of really taking a hard look and figuring out what the best strategy for them long-term is. Data centers can oftentimes be a challenging thing to move and relocate and to optimize too. So it's not necessarily the easiest process in the world either. So there are a number of barriers that I think oftentimes prevent companies from having their optimal data center deployment strategy. But in a perfect world, and I think this plays right into identifying where these opportunities exist, any kind of move event, whether it's a headquarters relocation or even a smaller office type move, it could be industrial or retail real estate oriented as well. Those are always good points to have a data center discussion and really dive into that. We're actually seeing more interest from industrial real estate owners and occupiers for data center services in the shipping and logistics arena. So if you've got a warehouse and you're sending out packages that will be delivered in 2 days or 24 hours, you need to have an inventory system which is synchronized, it's all up to date, and you have so many different items, so many different packages in that facility, oftentimes having little RFID sensors or things like that, that the amount of compute and information needed to understand your inventory is big. So that, again, is pushing things out to the edge, having that compute to give you those answers on a more local level to serve you more effectively. So it's really different for every organization, but I think there are certainly measurable and quantifiable benefits to having a honed-in data center strategy that's looking at how do we optimize this for the business? How do we drive additional revenue?
Right. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. And just hitting more on the opportunity side of things. So any move event or relocation, that's always a great time for discussions around data centers. A number of users, particularly in their office, will traditionally have built a little data center or like a lab space where they host the servers. And it's typically much more economical, actually, to place those servers into a co-location provider like an EdgeCore's building facility. It's cheaper overall, it's more reliable. And again, the enterprise organization doesn't have to put the capital into that. Consolidation and expansion are always great cadences for this conversation or a data center need. Typically runs in conjunction with like an M&A type of event. So anything like that is usually a red flag for there's a data center opportunity here of some sort, whether it's a new deal or it's a renewal, consolidation. And then change in business strategy, that's a big one. So we're seeing a lot of the auto manufacturers go from what they traditionally characterize themselves as a manufacturer. They're instead reinventing themselves and saying that we're going to be mobility or people connectivity providers. We're a transportation company, not an auto manufacturer. So they're injecting more of that technology into their product set and into their company. So there are a number of verticals and sectors that are having that change right now. And I think that's going to be ongoing if those companies want to survive and thrive in this ever evolving digital world. And then modernization of the organization. So if you look at a lot of financial services companies that have been around, like insurance, annuity companies, things like that, I think they're relatively antiquated in the ways that they oftentimes operate and deliver products and services to those customers. So a number of those have taken notice, fortunately, and they're working toward being a more technology-forward company. And data centers and different ways to host their IT infrastructure are a key component of that aspect. So this brings us back to EdgeCore. So why EdgeCore? Why is EdgeCore important, and why does our product set matter to folks? So again, in this world where your technology footprint is ever growing and your IT demands keep changing and evolving, we're building a platform that allows us to deliver a wide variety of products. So across your turnkey data center, where you move right in, all the way to a different level of fit out in like a powered shell type of format, which has less of the infrastructure in there. We can essentially do anything along that spectrum. So delivering the product set which matters to the end customer, and offering the ability to help them grow and scale, not only in the present, but in the future in those markets we control, and then within build-to-suit opportunities for them as well. We also have a significant amount of design and construction expertise, so that, again, helps us drive down those costs, build more efficiently. And then also we're incorporating a huge component of like renewables and then green kind of building practices and operating practices into our platform. So LEED certification for our data centers, construction approaches and methodologies that reduce waste. We build about 70% of our buildings off-site. We truck them in and then we assemble them. So really getting down from an efficiency perspective to drive costs, and then help drive down carbon footprint and things like that. And at the end of the day, the financial structure and the deal terms of a data center transaction, like any other real estate deal, are, I would say, probably of the utmost importance. So figuring out how do we make that financial structure align with that company's business goals. So one of the inherent advantages of being private and being backed by institutional capital is that we look at this business through a very long-term lens. So that allows us to be inherently flexible and do some things from a structure standpoint that other publicly traded data center companies can't. So trying to align contracts, footprint increases or decreases in the data center with the overall business's approach and strategy to their data center deployment. So trying to figure out how do we make our lease or our financial arrangement with you most conducive to your business. And network and cloud connectivity. While we're a wholesale data center operator focusing on those larger type customers, being connected to other users, other services is paramount. So we're building in connectivity ecosystems within these data centers where we have a large amount of network and capacity to distribute that information, those applications, to other people and other users out there. And all these things are well and good, but at the end of the day, a data center needs to operate. You need to, quote unquote, keep the lights on. So we've hired a world-class data center operations team that's outsourced at the moment to run our facilities. And there's a huge shift in the industry where data center providers like an EdgeCore are moving to more of an outsourced operations model. So that allows us to be more lean, grow where our customers want us to grow. And it also helps us drive down costs and then drive best practices as well. So that's kind of the why EdgeCore component here. And this brings us toward the back half of the presentation. So I'm sure to most of you on the phone, data centers are a relatively new or foreign thing. If you have any questions about them or have clients that might have a data center need, we'd be more than happy to walk you through that. Not only from a sales perspective, selfishly, but just from an academic perspective. We're always here to help people learn and answer questions. I think the data center card can be a really compelling and important one to play in front of clientele to not only win new business, but to retain it. So I know owners and companies out there are trying to keep data center professionals, or real estate professionals rather, on their toes and making sure that they're driving the best outcomes for them. So having another tool in your tool chest always helps. So think of me as a resource to answer any questions, to help you out with things. And if you have any questions about EdgeCore or a data center platform and how that could potentially help some of your customers improve their overall business, I'd love the opportunity and the chance to connect with you. So I've got my email, phone number, contact, and we've got some pages on kind of social media and kind of networking sites here below. So I encourage you to learn more about us, and please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions.
Okay, and we happen to have one. Someone says, since this is a very specialized area, what would you recommend for a broker that's interested in it to gain training and specialized knowledge to get involved in tenant rep in the data center area?
Yeah, good question. I think there are a number of different avenues where you could find information to study up on this. I think some of the real estate outlets, the large commercial firms like a CBRE, JLL, or a Cushman & Wakefield, they produce a lot of data center research reports. Those are typically more focused on general market dynamics, supply and demand. They do have information around what are kind of best practices, what are some kind of leading edge trends. There are a number of other companies out there like the Uptime Institute, Data Center Knowledge, that have good information around data centers. And the one thing which is interesting about the data center sector is it's not just the physical real estate. There needs to be a knowledge of electrical and mechanical systems, things like that. So it's kind of the culmination of real estate, finance, and engineering. So not that you have to be an expert in each of those fields, but it certainly helps to have a well-rounded education. So I would say those outlets are good resources for that. We also, EdgeCore, have some material around that too if it's helpful. So happy to distribute that as well.
Is there, when you're talking about, being pushed to the edge and these centers being brought closer to population areas as the need grows, is there a difference in sort of, when you're talking about so much power being necessary, does that put up any barriers, like with municipal permits and things like that? Does that become a challenge? Because it sounds like it's way more power than your ordinary corporate building.
Yeah, that's exactly correct, Amy. So there are a number of things that are very different about data centers than traditional commercial real estate. Our campus in Phoenix, Arizona, which I was at yesterday, has 225 megawatts of power that will provide the tenants on a long-term basis. So the amount of power it delivers is just astronomical compared to any type of traditional commercial building, whether it's office, retail, or industrial. So you do need special permits for getting not only the power to your site, and that's typically in the form of a substation just because there's so much capacity which is being delivered, but generator permits are a big thing, especially if you're out in California or those coastal markets where they have stricter regulations and rules around those. I think generator permits for California are anywhere from like 12 to 18 months out. Yeah. So there are a number of things from a development standpoint that you need to be cognizant of. And at our Mesa campus in particular, we signed up with the utility there that services our site. It's SRP, Salt River Project. We signed up with them probably a year and a half ago to get the amount of power we need allocated to us. So in order to get hundreds of megawatts, there's a waiting process. You have to make sure the utility has sufficient generation capacity for that. So there's a lot of due diligence and homework that goes into this. You can't just find a site and say, hey, we're going to build a data center here. So there's a lot of behind the scenes minutia that goes into it.
Are you finding that the power supplies are there, or are you guys needing to create them as you create the data centers?
Typically, they're there in some form or fashion. More than anything, there's oftentimes constraints or lead times around when that power can be delivered to your site. So in the Mesa example, again, we were fortunate enough to start the process early, and we have 3 competitors who are on the same road or essentially data center submarket that we're on, who are kind of boxed out of getting power for about 12 to 18 months. So because we're the first person in line, we have an advantage there from a timing perspective. So it's definitely a key component, and that really translates down to deals as well. There are a number of large hyperscale deals, which have been won by both private and public companies lately, that I think were won just based upon being in the right place at the right time with the right kind of power capacity. So I don't know, you need to have power to play in this game. That's for sure.
Yeah. Do you feel like there's going to be any pressure as the industry grows to be providing your own power? I mean, with the wind and solar gaining traction in the States, do you think that's going to be helpful?
I think it depends. I would say there's going to be less of a prevalence of data center providers offering their own power solution. I think what you'll see more of, and what we're actually working toward on a number of our sites, is partnering with that local utility provider to stand up some sort of generation capacity, which is green or renewable, that would be dedicated or accessible by our tenant base. So green energy, renewable energy is a big thing that we're seeing right now. In some markets, if you have enough of a long-term commitment from a contract standpoint, you can get the green power pricing to be at parity and sometimes less expensive than non-renewable energy sources. So I think that's really interesting. I'm excited to see what the future brings in that regard. But typically right now, you still pay a premium for that green or renewable power. And at the end of the day, the amount of power these facilities use is significant. So your traditional enterprise typically can't stomach that cost increase. When you're talking about a hyperscale user, though, someone who's a large internet or kind of social media type company, they've got the budget and the means to spend a little more on power and have that green component. And I think for those companies too, it makes sense, and it's nice from a social responsibility standpoint, just because their data center footprint and power consumption is so vast. So we'll certainly see the proliferation of green and renewable energy sources here.
It seems like being able to do that would definitely be something in your favor as you approach the municipal government and said, we'd like to put this here. And by the way, we can do this thing with green energy.
Yeah, that conversation, having a green or renewable energy story, is often table stakes for those large hyperscale type users. So it's something you have to have or be able to solve for them.
Okay. What would you say, when you talked earlier about there's, owning your own data center versus leasing it, what do you feel like is sort of the, size cutoffs for those sorts of things? When does it become efficient for an operation to have its own versus when is it more financially efficient to lease space in one that's already existing?
That's a good question. I think it's less of a size or capacity issue, Amy. I think it's more of a core competency conversation, and how does that organization derive revenue? So if you look at a large cloud service provider like an Amazon, a Microsoft, or a Google, their core business is offering cloud services which live in a data center. Right. So they are going to be much more suited to own and operate their own facility as opposed to a financial services company. So I would say, as a blanket statement, if you don't use your data center to directly drive revenue, and that's a big component of your business and your operations, you have no business building your own data center. It's just capital inefficient. And then even those large cloud providers, they look at this through the lens of, if I need to generate, call it a 30% or a 25% return on my cloud product, and that's what Wall Street wants to see, why am I going to invest hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of my capital into a data center, which supports that business, but at the end of the day, you're probably getting an 8% return or yield on that. So it makes more sense from a financial standpoint to lease, because you can allocate that capital to areas of the business with a higher and better use. Right. So there's a big cost of capital and opportunity cost conversation that needs to happen. And I think, as a general rule of thumb, anyone who's not in the business of driving and deriving revenue from your data center, there's no reason at all to build your own. And if you're looking for that kind of enterprise data center feel where it's dedicated to you, it's custom, it feels like you own the facility, that's where a build-to-suit comes in. And we're having a number of conversations with enterprises right now around build-to-suit offerings. So how can we build them their ideal data center, but have that in a different financial structure? So it's in a lease model, it's not owned, and then they get to benefit from our efficiencies and economies of scale in construction, design, operations, things like that. So you can essentially have your cake and eat it too if you want that look and feel of your own data center.
Right. Someone asks, can you please comment on EdgeCore REIT stock, current pricing and dividends paid, symbol? Oh, somebody's interested.
I wish we had a story to tell along those lines. We're brand new to the game, actually. So we're a privately held company, no plans to monetize here in the near future. I guess it pays to say our investors, they're of institutional grade. So our two main anchor investors are GIC, which is the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Singapore. They're, I think, the second or third largest asset manager in the world. They've got like $350, $60 billion of assets under management. And then OP Trust, they manage a large majority of Canadian pension fund money. So those are our two main anchor investors. They've given us the charter to go out and build a data center operating platform. So that's what we're doing right now in a private structure. Of course, I mean, long term, that could change. This is a business that's ripe with M&A, and then there's always the option of going public. So no stock ticker symbol right now, nothing like that, but stay tuned.
It sounds like a pretty exciting field to be in right now. It sounds like you guys are just on the edge of the Wild West a little bit.
Yeah, it's certainly a high growth industry. There's a lot happening. I think last year there was something in the neighborhood of $20 billion of M&A activity in our space, and it continues to grow. So we're an emerging asset class that I think is finally grabbing the attention of Wall Street.
That's cool. Yeah, I know I've been seeing more in publications and stuff like that. So, all right, I'm going to put a call out for anybody else to ask any more questions before we wrap up. If anybody has any thoughts, they want to type into the little Q&A box, give that a second. And if not, Jeremy, I want to thank you so much for doing this. This is super interesting. Like I said, I think this is really starting to become, to be bigger in everybody's consciousness later or now, since there's so much computerized everything going on, we can't get away from it. So. And I'm not getting any more questions, so I think that we can wrap that up. Jeremy, thank you so much. This was really great. I want to remind everybody listening that I'm going to post the recording of the webinar, and I will also post Jeremy's slideshow. If for some reason you can't find them, oh, here pops up another question. Go ahead and reach out to me. Yes, we can get a recording. If you have any questions, after we leave, go ahead and reach out to me, and I will do my best to. Oh, okay. Here is another good question. Is typically leased in a data center by square foot, by power requirements, or other? Ooh, that is a good question.
That's a good question. So data centers are a bit different than commercial real estate, and most co-location leases. You kind of measure or denominate the amount of, space or capacity utilized in a power format. So we quote things in dollars per kilowatt as opposed to dollars per square foot. And the reason for that is you could have a large building, so a massive amount of square footage with a small amount of power that's allocated to it. So most data center users are more interested in the amount of power they can draw for their IT equipment and that gear. So that's why we denominate those things in dollars per essentially unit of power or kilowatt. So that's how we measure things. And there's an underlying square footage component of that. So if I say, yeah, our space is $100 a kilowatt, and for each kilowatt you get, I don't know, making it up, you get 5 or 10 square feet. So there's always a square foot derivative of that, but they measure things from a power perspective. And that also goes back to the cost of the infrastructure. So the shell of the building, when all said and done, is relatively inexpensive to the cost of the generators, the electrical distribution equipment, the air handlers, the cooling equipment. So they're essentially buying and reserving the ability to use that power capacity over floor space. Right. So that's how we measure things in the data center world. There are other structures, if you're doing more of a powered shell, which you can think of as kind of like a warehouse type shell with some power infrastructure, conduit, things like that in the building. Those are typically denominated on a dollar per square foot basis, and then the tenant fronts all the capital investment for the infrastructure that's electrical, mechanical, and plumbing. So those are two ways to look at it. I would say most commonly, though, people run across the dollars per kilowatt as opposed to dollars per square foot.
Here's another question. It says, what's the takeaway for our listeners here today, the Realtor members, from doing business in this space? It seems super specialized and difficult to gain broker expertise, and the big three real estate firms are experts, seem to be the experts in this space. Yeah, many, because CBRE and JLL are not typically realtor shops. So what's the play for somebody who's in a smaller market or in a smaller office and not connected to one of those gigantic corporate real estate firms? What's important for the smaller brokers and agents to know about this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think on the smaller scale of things, and I might be making an incorrect assumption, but maybe if it's a smaller office you're working in or dealing with, clientele base that you have might be more of like an SMB as opposed to a large like Fortune 500 company. If that's the case, I would say there's a large opportunity for those like SMB type organizations, not only with data centers, but other services like cloud, managed hosting. So those are essentially consumption-based services where it's kind of like the easy button, if you will. It works out of the box. Someone else takes care of that stuff. And those small to medium businesses oftentimes don't have the resources internally to stand up a data center deployment. You need people to run the facility, to run the servers, all that stuff. And if you don't have that competency or that staff internally, there are other ways like with the cloud where that comes out of the box. You just need some people to, typically with a different skill set to run that, which is, I think, more accustomed to an SMB type of organization. So I think there are opportunities in data centers still, probably more through the managed hosting or cloud lens. Mm-hmm. But I think at the end of the day, if you're able to show measurable impact to your clients and the ability to drive different outcomes than they've received in the past or higher and better ones, that's certainly going to be a differentiator for you as like a real estate professional. And I think, again, just becoming educated in the space is key. And I think more than anything in the data center space, it's not necessarily about being at the largest company with the most resources like the big three that were mentioned. I think it's more about the competency and the knowledge of that individual, that professional, as opposed to the name on the business card. There are a number of small consulting shops out in the data center business. One I'm working on a large transaction with currently that, I mean, they do an incredible amount of business. So I think it's more subject matter based rather than the name on the business card.
Well, and it seems like, I mean, even as multifamily properties, the IoT aspect of so many new multifamily properties, it doesn't seem like this need is going to go away. It seems like even smaller projects that people wouldn't necessarily have anticipated something are eventually going to need access to these kind of places because the data needs are just going to increase exponentially with time.
Yeah, it's amazing the use cases and the applications. I mean, everything, when you look at it all around us, is connected. I mean, if you've got a computer, a smartphone, a smartwatch, you've probably got some other smart appliances in your house. I mean, it adds up pretty quickly. And I think you'd be surprised if you sat down and counted all those things that are using and consuming information. So that's certainly not going to change and is only going to increase over time here.
Okay. All right, great. Well, I think that was all of our questions, and I think we will wrap it up for real now. Again, thanks so much, Jeremy. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We will have another commercial webinar. It will be our last of 2018 on November 20th, and I'm not sure what the topic is going to be like. We're still working on that, but I will be sending out an email and posting it on our Facebook group. If you're not in our Facebook group, please join us for TAR Commercial, and you can find out more about other webinars and things that are happening by checking in there. Again, we will be posting this video and slideshow, and I guess that's it. Everybody have a great day. Stay dry if it's raining where you are. Stay warm if it's cold where you are. And Jeremy, thanks one more time. Everybody, take care. We'll see you soon.
No problem, Amy. Thank you again for the opportunity, and thank you everyone for tuning in today. Please feel free to reach out if you have any comments or questions. We'd be happy to help.
Great. Thanks, Jeremy. All right. Have a great day. Bye-bye.